A $1 million reward cannot buy a conviction if the crucial evidence has already been carelessly trampled into the Arizona desert dust. According to multiple reports, they treated the entire property as if an elderly citizen had simply become confused and wandered off into the brush on her own. In a violent kidnapping, the first 48 hours are known as the golden hours. This is the critical window where a crime scene must be immediately locked down with yellow tape. Only highly trained forensic technicians wearing protective suits should be allowed to cross that threshold. They must photograph every dust particle swab, every surface for DNA, and document the exact position of every object before the environment is altered. But because the deputies declared it a search and rescue operation, they invited total chaos into the most crucial location of the entire case. Instead of securing the flower pots and the door frames as vital evidence, they allowed search teams, family members, and law enforcement personnel to trample directly through the primary crime scene. Every boot that stepped onto the patio potentially crushed microscopic evidence. Every ungloved hand that touched a door frame to look outside potentially wiped away the perpetrator's fingerprints and replaced them with the DNA of a well-meaning deputy. That single disastrous decision set off a rapid chain reaction of forensic destruction that legal experts and media commentators on Fox News and The Guardian have fiercely criticized this monumental procedural breakdown. A defense attorney will relentlessly attack this exact failure during cross-examination. They will look the jury in the eye and ask how they can possibly trust a single piece of physical evidence collected from a house that was treated like a public walking path. The legal concept of contamination will be the cornerstone of the defense strategy. If the prosecution tries to introduce a hair follicle or a fabric fiber found near the back door, the defense will simply argue that it could have been tracked in by any of the dozens of people who freely walked through the unsecured house during the initial search. By failing to recognize the blatant signs of an abduction, the local authorities handed the suspected criminal the greatest gift imaginable. They practically sanitized the crime scene for him. They erased the invisible links tying the suspect to the property. Will ultimately give any competent defense attorney the ultimate get out of jail free card. The sheer incompetence of treating a staged extraction as a lost senior citizen case creates an ocean of reasonable doubt that is almost impossible to drain. The physical scene is entirely compromised. The golden hours were completely wasted looking for a wandering woman instead of hunting a calculating predator. The prosecutors will be forced to stand in a courtroom completely stripped of their most powerful physical evidence. Their entire physical case at the house has been rendered legally useless by the boots of their own initial responders. With the physical crime scene hopelessly contaminated, the prosecution has only one fragile lifeline left to cling to. They must completely abandon the ruined physical environment and turn their desperate attention to the invisible digital signals floating in the local servers. If you want to see how digital forensics attempts to salvage a ruined physical investigation, hit subscribe to Seth's Crime Vault and join our community of deep analytical researchers. The pivot from physical evidence to digital tracking is a move born out of pure desperation. The prosecution knows that the jury expects tangible proof. How exactly do the initial responding officers accidentally hand a future defense team the most powerful legal weapon possible? They expect a smoking gun or a definitive DNA match found directly inside the home. But because the local response obliterated that possibility, the burden of proof shifts entirely to the realm of technology. They have to prove that a phantom presence can be tracked through data alone. This is an incredibly difficult legal mountain to climb because defense attorneys are experts at poking holes in technological timelines. They will demand to know why the jury should trust invisible data over the catastrophic reality of the physical crime scene. The digital ghosts are the only witnesses left. The federal agents who eventually took over the disastrous local investigation knew that the physical house was a lost cause. They immediately shifted their entire focus to the digital footprint of the crime. The prosecution will rely heavily on this technological timeline to build their narrative because data does not get trampled by police boots. The digital timeline is cold, hard, and precise. We are going to break down exactly how the foundational legal principle known as the chain of custody was utterly shattered before the sun even came up. According to national reporting from Time magazine, the first major digital anomaly occurred at exactly 1:45 in the morning. The Nest doorbell camera positioned at the home was abruptly disconnected. This was not a power failure or a random internet outage. It was a deliberate, targeted severing of the surveillance feed. The alleged suspect knew exactly where the camera was located, and they knew exactly how to blind it. This specific timestamp establishes the absolute starting point of the physical breach. The suspect was on the property tampering with the security systems and preparing to initiate the extraction. The defense will undoubtedly try to argue that a disconnected camera proves nothing other than a faulty internet connection. But the prosecution has a second, far more terrifying data point to present. At exactly 2:28 in the morning, a deeply personal piece of technology went dark. If you want us to keep exposing the legal cracks that let suspects walk free, hit subscribe to Seth's Crime Vault and turn on notifications. Nancy wore a pacemaker that continuously monitored her vital signs and transmitted that data to a phone monitoring application. At 2:28, that vital connection was violently severed. This is the most crucial piece of evidence the prosecution currently holds. The gap between the camera disconnecting at 1:45 and the pacemaker going offline at 2:28 represents exactly 43 minutes of sheer terror. In that 43-minute window, the alleged perpetrator successfully navigated the dark property, bypassed the locked doors, propped open the back gates with the flower pots, and physically extracted an 84-year-old woman. The abrupt disconnection of the pacemaker strongly indicates the exact moment she was forcibly removed from the immediate vicinity of her monitoring device. The FBI agents analyzing this data realized immediately that they were looking at the precise timeline of a highly orchestrated kidnapping. The digital evidence paints a picture of a rapid and violent removal that perfectly matches the physical staging of the back patio. The prosecution will use these two timestamps to frame their entire argument. To understand why a future trial could completely collapse, we first have to look closely. They will tell the jury that the suspect spent 43 minutes executing a flawless home invasion. But even the most compelling digital timeline has a fatal legal flaw. Data can tell you exactly when a crime occurred, but it cannot tell you who committed the crime. A severed internet connection does not contain DNA. A disconnected pacemaker does not capture facial recognition. The digital evidence is entirely circumstantial. It proves an abduction happened, but it does not definitively point to a specific person sitting at the defense table. A skilled defense attorney will look at the prosecution and calmly state that while the timeline is tragic, it does not prove their client was the one who pulled the wires. To secure a conviction beyond a reasonable doubt, the prosecution desperately needs a piece of physical evidence that directly links the suspect to that 43-minute window at the victim and the physical reality of her life right before the nightmare started. They need something tangible that bridges the gap between the digital ghost and a real human being. The contaminated house offered absolutely nothing. The federal task force was forced to expand their search grid far beyond the ruined perimeter of the property. They scoured the desolate landscape, hoping that the meticulous suspect made a single careless mistake during their escape. They needed the suspect to drop something or leave a piece of themselves behind in the dirt. And deep in the desert brush, miles away from the compromised crime scene, they finally found what they were looking for. The search teams discovered a piece of physical evidence that seemed like an absolute miracle for the desperate prosecutors. It was a tangible object left behind on the escape route that had the potential to hold the ultimate biological key to the mystery. The digital timeline gave them the win, but this item was supposed to finally give them the who. The prosecution believed they had finally found the missing link. If they could extract a clean genetic profile from this object, they could finally build an airtight case. The prosecution needs an airtight narrative to secure a conviction beyond a reasonable doubt. The item was rushed to a federal laboratory for advanced forensic testing. The entire legal strategy hinged on the results of that single biological analysis. The tension within the legal team was absolute as they awaited results. The pressure compounding on the state is staggering. Despite an unprecedented federal manhunt sweeping across the Southwest, the masked phantom remains completely invisible to the authorities. The family of the victim, desperate to break the terrifying silence, introduced a staggering financial incentive. A staggering $1 million reward was broadcast across every national media outlet. That kind of money is designed to shatter loyalties and compel accomplices to turn against each other. It is a massive bounty intended to force a crack in the armor of the alleged kidnapper. Yet the days turned into weeks and the silence only grew more profound. But building an airtight case is physically impossible when the foundational pieces of your puzzle have been compromised by the very people supposed to collect them. The public outrage did not just target the unknown assailant. The fury of the community and prominent legal analysts was aimed directly at the leadership of the local jurisdiction. Pima County Sheriff Chris Nanos found himself at the epicenter of a massive professional backlash. The constituents and the media demanded accountability for the initial assessment that allowed the scene to be compromised. The department head faced intense scrutiny over how those critical early hours were managed under his watch. The community felt deeply betrayed by the system that was supposed to protect them. This anger was not just emotional, it was rooted in the terrifying realization that a predator was walking free because of administrative incompetence. The local department had essentially handed the state prosecutors a fractured puzzle. The legal team knew that trying to secure an indictment based solely on technological timestamps and a mismanaged property was a guaranteed path to a not guilty verdict. The entire nation desperately wants to see justice served for the terrifying abduction of an 84-year-old woman. The disaster begins the night before. The dark zone officially began at exactly 9:50 in the evening. They desperately needed an anchor. They needed an object that was far away from the chaotic footprint of the initial search and rescue teams. And as searchers combed the rugged terrain extending far past the property lines, they discovered something that sent a surge of hope through the command center. According to confirmed reporting from Fox 10 Phoenix, a glove was recovered deep in the desert over 2 miles away from the compromised property. This discovery shifted the entire momentum of the investigation. A glove is not just a piece of fabric. In the eyes of a forensic scientist, it is a sponge for biological material. The interior lining absorbs sweat and dead skin cells from the wearer, while the exterior can capture trace elements from the victim's clothing or the interior of a getaway vehicle. Finding this item 2 miles out was crucial. It meant the object was far beyond the perimeter of the initial wander-off search grid. Nancy Guthrie was safely dropped off at her secluded home in the Catalina Foothills by her son-in-law, Tommaso Cioni. The deputies and the volunteers who accidentally tracked through the patio never made it this far out into the wilderness. This physical artifact was theoretically pristine. It represented a clean slate for the prosecution. If the laboratory could extract a clear genetic profile from the lining of that fabric, the state would finally have the undeniable proof they needed to name a suspect and bring them to trial. The state legal team braced for the results, holding their breath as the technicians processed the material. They envisioned a scenario where they could confidently walk into a courtroom, hold up the evidence bag, and present a definitive match to a known criminal or a highly suspect individual. This was their chance to bypass the disaster at the house and build an airtight argument based on hard science. They needed this biological link to validate the timeline and prove the identity of the phantom. But the realm of criminal justice is rarely that straightforward. This precise timestamp is the absolute anchor of the entire investigation and the starting point for every legal argument that will follow. Every piece of physical evidence carries an inherent risk. The defense strategy relies heavily on the concept of reasonable doubt, and physical artifacts found in the open environment are highly vulnerable to alternative explanations. A skilled attorney will always question how an object ended up in a specific location and who else might have interacted with it before it was collected. The state needed the laboratory results to be absolutely definitive to overcome any potential challenges regarding the discovery of the item. They needed a clean hit that pointed directly to a singular, undisputed truth. The wait for the genetic analysis was an agonizing period of suspense for everyone involved in the pursuit of justice. They placed all their hopes on the microscopic cells trapped inside that recovered fabric. They believed this was the breakthrough that would finally unravel the mystery and provide a clear path to a conviction. The prosecution prepared to pivot their entire strategy around this singular piece of evidence. They were ready to construct a compelling narrative that connected the distant discovery back to the terrifying events at the house. Nancy was 84 years old. She was officially classified as a vulnerable adult with very specific, limited mobility. But the results emerging from the sterile laboratory were about to shatter those expectations and plunge the state into an absolute legal nightmare. The forensic report from the federal laboratory was supposed to be the ultimate weapon for the prosecution, but instead it became their absolute worst nightmare. When the technicians finally isolated the genetic material from the recovered glove and ran it through the national databases, the system did not return a match for a sophisticated criminal mastermind. It did not identify a known violent offender with a history of home invasions. According to confirmed reporting from Fox 10 Phoenix, the biological profile extracted from that critical piece of evidence belonged to an entirely unrelated local restaurant worker. This revelation is nothing short of catastrophic for the state. To understand the sheer magnitude of this forensic disaster, we must look at how a defense attorney will weaponize this information inside a courtroom. Finding the DNA of an innocent civilian on a piece of evidence linked to an escape route is the holy grail for a defense team. It is the textbook definition of a dead end that actively harms the prosecution. She was not an athletic hiker capable of scaling rocky terrain in the pitch black cold of the desert night. The state banked their entire strategy on this item being the pristine, uncompromised link to the alleged kidnapper. Now they are forced to explain why a random culinary employee left their genetic signature on an object supposedly worn by a highly calculated phantom. The defense will absolutely tear this discrepancy apart in front of a jury. They will not even have to work hard to establish reasonable doubt because the state just handed it to them on a silver platter. Imagine the opening statement from the defense. They will look directly at the jury and calmly explain that the local law enforcement first destroyed the primary crime scene by treating it like a lost person case. Then they will point out that the only major piece of physical evidence recovered miles away contains the biological material of a completely innocent person who serves food in the community. They will ask the jury a very simple but devastating question. Her physical limitations are the most vital pieces of context in this entire case because if the authorities are so incompetent that they ruined the house and then tried to pin the crime on a glove worn by a cook, how can you possibly trust them when they point the finger at my client? The unrelated genetic profile provides the defense with the perfect alternative narrative. They can argue that the true perpetrator is still out there, or they can argue that the entire investigation is so fundamentally flawed that no piece of evidence can be trusted. This is known as introducing an alternative suspect theory, and it is incredibly effective at derailing a conviction. The prosecution now has to waste valuable time and resources investigating the restaurant worker just to formally clear them and explain away their connection to the item. Did the worker accidentally drop it on their way home? Did the real suspect steal it from a lost and found bin to use during the crime? Every possible explanation sounds like a desperate excuse to cover up a botched investigation. The state looks disorganized and unreliable. Immediately destroy the narrative that she could have left the property on her own accord. A jury relies on the state to provide a clear, cohesive, and logical narrative that eliminates all other possibilities. But this forensic twist introduces a massive chaotic variable that shatters any sense of certainty. The glove was supposed to save the case, but instead it introduced a toxic level of doubt. The prosecution is now trapped in an impossible position. If they bring a suspect to trial, they have to disclose this conflicting genetic evidence to the defense. By law, they cannot hide information that might prove the innocence of the accused. So they are forced to present a case where their own physical evidence actively points away from the person sitting at the defense table. It is a legal paradox that makes securing a guilty verdict almost impossible. The state must somehow convince 12 jurors to ignore the physical biology found on the escape route and trust their circumstantial technological timeline instead. But jurors love physical science. They have been conditioned by media to expect definitive genetic matches. She lived a quiet, predictable life, heavily supported by the constant vigilance of her nearby family, including her daughter Savannah. When the science points to a random civilian, the entire foundation of the state arguments crumbles into dust. The defense will constantly remind the jury that the only verifiable physical trace left in the desert belongs to someone else entirely. They will hammer home the idea that the state is guessing that they are grasping at straws because they ruined their only real chance at the house. This is exactly why the upcoming legal battle is going to be a bloodbath for the prosecutors. They are walking into an arena armed with a broken timeline and contaminated science. The harsh reality of this terrifying ordeal is that the legal system is currently paralyzed. As of April 2026, the authorities have not officially named a suspect, and absolutely no arrests have been made. The massive federal intervention and the highly publicized $1 million reward have failed to produce the person responsible for this highly coordinated attack. The case remains in a state of agonizing limbo for the family and the surrounding community. Time is the ultimate enemy in any major investigation, and with every passing day, the trail grows colder and the memories of potential witnesses begin to fade. The house was her sanctuary designed to accommodate her specific needs and provide a safe environment for her to rest. The lack of an arrest means that the prosecution has not yet had to face the nightmare scenario waiting for them in the courtroom. But the legal community knows exactly what is coming. They understand that the moment a suspect is finally placed in handcuffs, the clock starts ticking on an incredibly fragile case. The state will have to build a narrative that can withstand the most brutal cross-examination imaginable. They must prepare to defend the catastrophic errors made during those initial golden hours and explain away the bizarre genetic twist found in the desert brush. It is a monumental task that requires a flawless presentation of the remaining circumstantial evidence. The burden of proof rests entirely on the shoulders of the state. The defense does not have to prove their client is innocent. They only have to prove that the state does not know for certain that they are guilty. And in this specific investigation, uncertainty is the only thing that has been clearly established. When Tommaso drove away at 9:50, he left behind a woman who was physically incapable of undertaking a spontaneous midnight journey through the unforgiving Arizona wilderness. The ruined property and the random civilian biology are massive roadblocks on the path to justice. To overcome these obstacles, the state would likely need an overwhelming amount of new undeniable evidence. They would need the alleged perpetrator to possess items belonging to the victim, or they would need a detailed confession that matches undisclosed facts of the crime. Without a smoking gun, the state is walking a tightrope over a legal abyss. The community continues to wait for answers while the phantom remains at large. The fear that a predator capable of bypassing locked doors and evading a federal dragnet is still out there casts a long, dark shadow over the region. The family is forced to endure the excruciating pain of the unknown, hoping for a breakthrough that seems to be constantly slipping further away. The system that was built to protect them has stumbled at every critical juncture, leaving them isolated in their pursuit of closure. And amidst all the legal maneuvering and forensic analysis, the most haunting question remains completely unanswered. Why her? Of all the isolated homes in the desert, why did this highly calculated individual specifically target an elderly woman with limited mobility? The public fully expects a swift trial and a definitive guilty verdict that locks the perpetrator away for the rest of their life. She would have prepared for bed, locked her doors, and settled in for the... Was it a random crime of opportunity executed by someone testing their terrifying skills? Or was there a deeply hidden motive that investigators have yet to uncover? The absolute silence from the suspect provides no clues regarding their intent. There are no ransom demands to analyze and no manifestos to decode. The absence of a clear motive makes it incredibly difficult to profile the suspect and predict their next move. It also makes it harder for the state to build a compelling narrative for the jury. Without a motive, the crime seems like a senseless act of violence, which is terrifying but difficult to prosecute without solid physical evidence. The investigators are left staring at a fractured puzzle, missing the most important pieces. The upcoming battle in the courtroom, if it ever happens, will be a masterclass in reasonable doubt. The prosecution will fight valiantly to secure justice for the victim, but the defense has already been given all the ammunition they need to dismantle the state's arguments. Knight, relying on the structure of her home to keep the outside world at bay. The scales of justice are heavily tipped against the authorities, and the path forward is fraught with insurmountable legal challenges. The terrifying truth is that an airtight plan combined with a flawed law enforcement response creates a nearly perfect shield for the guilty. Until the authorities can pierce that shield, the elusive phantom will continue to evade the reach of the law. To truly comprehend the depth of this legal disaster, we must analyze the specific mechanisms of the courtroom. The first critical concept is the chain of custody. This refers to the chronological documentation showing the seizure, custody, control, and transfer of physical evidence. When local deputies failed to secure the immediate area around the compromised entrances, they fundamentally broke this chain. A broken chain allows a defense attorney to successfully argue that evidence could have been planted, altered, or accidentally contaminated, rendering it legally inadmissible. The second concept is exculpatory evidence, which is any information that might exonerate the defendant. The biology from the restaurant worker found in the desert is the ultimate example of exculpatory evidence. This is why the eventual defense attorney will aggressively focus on her physical state. Prosecutors are legally obligated to hand this information over to the defense during discovery. A competent defense team will use that external genetic profile to build a highly credible alternative suspect theory, making it incredibly easy for a jury to find reasonable doubt. What this case teaches us about the fragility of justice is absolutely chilling. It demonstrates that justice is not merely stolen by the brilliant execution of a criminal mastermind. It is frequently dismantled by the administrative negligence of the people sworn to uphold the law. The justice system is a delicate ecosystem that relies entirely on procedural perfection. When the initial response fails, the entire structure collapses inward. This is the core focus of our legal analysis, because understanding these systemic failures is the only way to demand accountability. We analyze these catastrophic procedural breakdowns to show how the technicalities of the law can sometimes protect the guilty. If she could not walk far, then someone had to carry her or force her into a vehicle. The rules of evidence are strict for a reason, but in this scenario, those exact rules will likely be the shield that keeps a dangerous predator out of a prison cell. Catching a suspect is only the first step in the long, grueling march toward actual justice. Putting them behind bars permanently is an entirely different battle. In the deeply troubling case of this missing 84-year-old woman, that crucial second step may have been fatally sabotaged on the very first night. When the physical footprint is trampled into dust and the only remaining biological clue points to an innocent civilian, the state is left holding an empty bag. If the forensic science is shattered and the timeline is entirely circumstantial, how can any future jury ever return a guilty verdict with absolute confidence? Will a future conviction inevitably be forced to rely entirely on an unlikely confession or a sudden betrayal from an unknown accomplice? The terrifying reality is that a brilliant defense attorney may already have everything they need to set a guilty person free. The legal system is broken, and the courtroom currently awaits the final act of this devastating tragedy. And if someone forced her into a vehicle, they had to leave physical traces of that violent interaction behind. If you want to track the legal fallout of this case and others like it, hit subscribe to Seth's Crime Vault. Turn on your notifications so you never miss an update on the pursuit of the elusive truth. The prosecution will need to prove exactly how she was removed, but the baseline fact remains that she was completely dependent on a safe environment. The Catalina Foothills offer a deceptive illusion of security. The expansive properties are isolated, separated by stretches of harsh natural landscape. This isolation means there are fewer watching eyes and fewer neighbors to hear a sudden disturbance. As the clock ticked past midnight, the house sat completely silent. But the cold, hard reality of the American courtroom tells a completely different and far more frustrating story. Nancy was presumably asleep, totally unaware that her limited mobility made her the perfect target for a predator who understood exactly how to exploit the layout of her home. The chilling reality is that the alleged perpetrator did not just stumble upon this property by pure chance. They must have known the schedule. They must have waited for the family to leave the premises. They waited patiently in the freezing temperatures until the house was entirely vulnerable. The contrast between the loving family dinner she enjoyed just hours earlier and the creeping threat waiting outside is profoundly disturbing. Someone was out there in the desert brush watching the lights turn off one by one. And most terrifyingly, this unseen figure already knew exactly where the heavy flower pots were positioned on the back patio. They were about to weaponize the victim's own belongings against her to ensure a completely silent extraction. The defense will eventually ask the jury to consider the immense level of premeditation required to pull off such a smooth invasion. Even if federal agents managed to capture the alleged kidnapper tomorrow morning, to bypass the security of a locked home without waking the surrounding neighborhood requires intimate knowledge of the physical environment. The suspect had to navigate the exterior of the property in total darkness without tripping over landscaping or making enough noise to alert the sleeping homeowner. The silence of the house was a vulnerability that was ruthlessly exploited. As the hours passed, the sanctuary was slowly transforming into a carefully staged trap. The peaceful desert night was masking a highly coordinated intrusion that would leave behind a baffling puzzle. When the sun rose the next morning, the quiet isolation of the home was shattered by the alarming realization that Nancy was simply gone. But the environment she left behind was not an empty canvas. It was a highly specific crime scene littered with deliberate physical clues that screamed of a forced abduction. According to investigative reports from News Nation, there was a chilling and highly calculated detail discovered at the rear of the property. The heavy decorative flower pots from the patio had been physically moved from their usual positions. Prosecution is going to face an absolute legal nightmare when they finally stand before a jury. They were deliberately used as mechanical props to wedge the back gate and the screen doors completely open. This is not a random detail. This is a massive forensic indicator of a meticulously planned escape route. The alleged kidnapper used the victim's own property to ensure their exit path remained unobstructed. Prop doors do not swing shut. They do not make a sudden loud clicking noise that might alert a neighbor or wake the victim before the suspect is ready to move. This physical evidence proves that the suspect needed a wide, clear path to quickly transport a victim with limited mobility out into the darkness. A defense attorney will look at those flower pots and see a brilliant opportunity. They will argue that whoever moved those heavy objects had to have touched them with their hands or bumped against them with their clothing. Those pots should have been treated as highly sensitive forensic gold mines capable of yielding microscopic skin cells, sweat, or trace fabric fibers from the true perpetrator. Every single inch of those patio doors and every speck of dirt on those ceramic pots held the potential to identify the exact person who breached the home. And the primary reason for this impending judicial disaster has absolutely nothing to do with the cunning brilliance or the meticulous planning of the suspected criminal. If the prosecution wants to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that a specific individual committed this crime, they need the biological evidence that should have been clinging to those makeshift doorstops. The logic is painfully simple. You cannot move heavy objects to create an escape corridor without interacting with the physical environment. And in the world of modern forensic science, every interaction leaves a trace. But the tragedy of this case is that those incredibly valuable physical clues were sitting in a house that was about to be completely misunderstood. The deliberate staging of the scene should have immediately triggered a massive criminal investigation protocol. The open doors were a blaring siren indicating that a home invasion had just occurred. A woman who struggles with mobility does not wake up in the dead of night, move heavy flower pots to wedge her own doors open and then vanish into the freezing desert. The narrative of a confused senior citizen going for a spontaneous walk is entirely contradicted by the calculated use of those patio props. It has everything to do with the catastrophic procedural failures of the very local authorities sworn to protect the physical evidence. Someone else was there. Someone else staged the exit. And that someone else left their invisible signature all over the backyard. The frustration builds when you realize that the answers to this entire mystery were likely sitting right there on the concrete patio. The biological map leading straight to the suspect was waiting to be meticulously collected, cataloged, and tested in a sterile laboratory. The family knew instantly that a sinister event had taken place because they understood her physical limitations. The evidence of the flower pot supported their worst fears. Yet, when the authorities finally arrived to assess the situation, they looked at the exact same open doors and the exact same moved objects, and somehow arrived at a conclusion that would legally paralyze the prosecution for years to come. The stage was set for a forensic catastrophe. The defense will eventually capitalize on this exact moment of disconnect. When the first officers arrived at the scene of a highly calculated and violent extraction, they failed to see a crime at all. They will point out that the clues were undeniable but completely ignored. How can a jury trust the ultimate findings of an investigation if the very first responders could not correctly identify a blatantly staged crime scene? The flower pots are the ultimate symbol of the systemic failure. They were the key to the entire case, physically holding the back doors open and silently waiting for a competent forensic team that would never arrive in time. The physical evidence was practically begging to be found, but the system chose to look the other way. The most devastating blow to any future trial did not come from the alleged kidnapper, but from the initial decisions made by the Pima County Sheriff Department. When local deputies arrived at the Catalina Foothills property, they officially categorized the horrifying disappearance as a routine wander-off incident. They looked at the home of a vulnerable 84-year-old woman with limited mobility and concluded she had simply gotten lost in the desert. This